It's a pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Sarah Rothman. Many of you will probably know Sarah pretty well. She's been around the department now just over 3 years. And I thought I'd just give a little bit of an introduction to Sarah because she has really accomplished quite a lot since she's been here and beforehand. Sarah earned her bachelor's in environmental science from Franklin and Marshall College, just up the road in Pennsylvania. She received a number of awards there, including one, a Marshall Fellow Award, which allowed her to study lion conservation in Zimbabwe, which was really neat. She also did some really interesting work at Valley Forge National Historic Park as an undergraduate, summer interning, looking at white-tailed deer populations and forest understory regeneration. After Sarah graduated, she actually taught first and third grade science in an elementary school in Brooklyn, New York, before she embarked on her master's in ecology at Penn State. And there she studied wildflower meadow restoration on surface mines. So that's been really interesting as well. So during her time at the University of Maryland, Sarah has published 2 papers, one of which she was a first author in the Journal of Medical Entomology, and she's presented her work at various conferences, including 2 international conferences. And I think in both of them, she was awarded first prize in the student competition. I think as you've seen Sarah present, she has a really good knack for describing complex topics very simply and logically, and she represented the university in the 3-minute thesis competition, which was an international competition, which was a great accomplishment. So Sarah is kind of winding things up. She received a Wiley Fellowship from the graduate school for this coming fall, hopefully finish off some final analyses and write up, and hopefully defend this fall-winter period. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Sarah, and thanks very much.
Yeah, thank you for the introduction. This again. I am really excited to share my research with everyone. I feel like I've become part of the community here over the last few years, and I've gotten a lot of opportunity to share little bits of whatever I'm up to at the time as I'm talking with everybody. And yeah, I'm looking forward to kind of putting all those little bits together and hopefully giving you a broader overview of the dissertation as a whole. Can everybody hear me okay without the hand mic? Okay, perfect. I do want to begin with a land acknowledgement because both the land we are currently on, as well as all the areas in which I do my field work, are unceded land of the Piscataway, Susquehannock, and Accochtank people. So I want to honor the indigenous communities that live here. I often begin my talks by sharing that mosquitoes are the deadliest animal in the world. Some of you may know that, have heard me say it before if you've seen my 3MT, but I think this video is really great in helping to visualize that. I'm just going to speed it up a bit. So this video shows the number of people killed each year by various types of animals, some of which people think are much deadlier. But the outsized impact that mosquitoes have is actually quite astounding. Mosquitoes transmit dozens of arboviruses, so they can bite an infected host, become infected themselves, and then spread that virus to their next uninfected blood meal. One of the most deadly mosquito diseases is malaria, but here the most common mosquito-borne disease is West Nile virus. It's likely an undercount, the people that we know infected with West Nile, because it can be asymptomatic or it can be confused with the flu. We are pretty privileged, though, that for most of us, I think we think of mosquitoes more as a nuisance rather than a dire public health threat. And so I would like to point out that mosquitoes actually have an influence on human health and well-being, even if they're not carrying a disease. You can raise your hand if you've had the experience of sitting outside, enjoying your garden or taking a walk, and then being driven back indoors. Yeah, by how awful they are. We'll talk a little bit about that later. But yeah, mosquito infestations often discourage outdoor activity. And of course, exercise, moving your body is so good. It's also great for mental health and well-being. And one study actually connected mosquito biting rates with childhood obesity rates. So in addition to acute disease events, mosquitoes actually do also pose a threat to chronic health. And finally here, we're getting to the impact from mosquitoes. So it's pretty staggering what an impact they have. So hopefully I've convinced you that mosquitoes are enough of a public health threat, even here, that it's something we need to be thinking about. And in addition to being an issue for public health, mosquitoes are also a threat to environmental justice. We'll get more into this later, but we have studies showing that mosquitoes pose a greater risk to residents in lower income neighborhoods, which is of course not acceptable and something we want to try to unravel so we can begin to address it. And that's when we'll get into how plants come into play. I think there is a common misconception that mosquitoes only feed on blood. It's actually just the female mosquitoes that need to take a blood meal, and they do that to get the proteins that they need to lay eggs. Otherwise, adult mosquitoes will get their energy for flying, their metabolism from sugars, from vegetation, and plants are a crucial resource at the larval stage as well. We'll get into that. And to kind of connect the rest of these dots, there's also a relationship that we found between plants and socioeconomic status. Again, usually in a direction that is unfair for residents in socioeconomically disadvantaged areas. So we do know quite a bit about these individual relationships, and the work that I'm doing is novel in trying to bring them all together. These are three really important components of the urban ecosystem that all interact, and we need to look at them in their interactions. To give you an idea of what that specifically looks like in my dissertation, I begin with a literature review that I'm preparing for publication, in which I argue that vegetation is an underexplored mechanism in this mosquito socioeconomics relationship that's beginning to emerge and gain more attention. And then through that, I've got a chapter based on field-based surveys in which I was trying to uncover if there are differences in the urban plant community along socioeconomic gradients. There are, teaser for that. And then using those results for lab-based trials, testing first detritus and then the effects of temperature. Both of these things vary along income and abandonment gradients. And I want to know how those impacts affect mosquito life history traits, population growth rate, as well as the outcome of competition. So diving into some of the background that'll help prep you for the later chapters. These are the two mosquito species that I work with. The one on the left is Aedes albopictus, the tiger mosquito, and this one is Culex pipiens, the northern house mosquito. These two make up 90% or more of all mosquitoes that we sample in Baltimore and DC, so they really dominate, and that's why I'm focusing on them. Neither of them are native. Aedes albopictus came to the US through Texas in 1985, and then quickly spread up the East Coast. They've been named the most successful invader of the century. They're aggressive daytime biters and they love people. So any of you thinking to yourselves, I don't remember getting bitten this badly when I was younger, you probably weren't. And unfortunately, they can carry numerous diseases, including Zika, West Nile, chikungunya. As can the northern house mosquito. It's one of the main vectors in amplifying West Nile amongst bird populations. They really love to feed on birds. They came to the US in the 1700s is best guess, so they're not native either, but they are a resident species. They've been here for quite a while. Like Aedes albopictus, they've become well adapted to living in urban environments around people, and they can also transmit diseases. So unfortunately, as I said, the likelihood of being exposed to a mosquito-borne illness is not uniform across a city, normally varying in a direction that puts lower income residents at an unjust risk. And we can measure how likely you are to be exposed to a mosquito-borne disease by looking at vectorial capacity, which incorporates a lot of factors that we know to vary along with socioeconomics. So for example, vector density. The more mosquitoes are around, the more likely you are to be bitten. And a study by Ledoux et al., among others, have found more numerous mosquito populations on lower income Baltimore blocks. A study also in Baltimore by Goodman et al. Found that the total number of people bitten was also higher in lower income blocks compared to higher income blocks. A study by Katz et al. Found that mosquitoes were larger on blocks with higher rates of infrastructural abandonment, so buildings that are vacant and in some stage of decay. And larger mosquitoes tend to live longer. This is a big issue because if a mosquito emerges, she bites a host and then dies, she doesn't have the opportunity to pass that on. The longer she lives, the more blood meals she can take, and the more likely she is to both pick up and then transmit a disease. And then finally, both the length of a pathogen's extrinsic incubation period and a mosquito's vector competence, not that you need to know exactly what those are, they're both bad, and they both tend to increase in higher temperatures. Studies in numerous cities, including Baltimore, have found that lower income blocks tend to be hotter. So the microclimate does vary even amongst very short distances, and this can create more of a problem. So we want to figure out why this is. And I think plants are a really important mechanism in explaining these relationships. So here you're looking at the life cycle of our two target mosquito species, Aedes albopictus on the left, Culex pipiens on the right. They are almost the same, small difference in the way the eggs are laid. But basically in both cases, the female will take a blood meal, she'll lay her eggs in artificial container habitats where water can collect. In an urban area, this is likely to be a piece of trash, like a chip bag or a cup, or it could be a flower pot or a trash can with the lid left open. Those eggs will emerge into a larval stage. And as larvae, the mosquitoes feed on microbes that are supported by dead and decaying organic matter. Often that detritus is from leaves in the canopy that fall into these water holding containers and break down. This breeding habitat, the quality of the nutritional resources when mosquito are larvae is hugely influential for the rest of their life cycle. So once they go from their larval stage to their pupal stage and then emerge as an adult, a lot of these adult characteristics, like how large they are, how long they live, how many eggs the female will lay, are determined by the conditions they experienced as larvae. So that's really the life stage that I'm going to be focusing on. Now, lab studies have found that the quantity and quality my monitor went, but you can see that. Okay. The quantity and quality of the detritus that's in that water holding container can influence some of those same life history traits that we saw in the vectorial capacity equation that are important to disease transmission. It can affect abundance, the probability of survival, how large those adults are. And this is based on differences in biomass, so the total number of leaves that might fall into a container, as well as what species of leaf falls into the container. And actually, depending on the composition of that tidal resource base, that can affect the outcome of competition between these two species. Often, Aedes albopictus is the superior competitor, and all things being equal, will outcompete Culex pipiens. And yet we have not seen that Culex pipiens have been pushed out in all areas of its range where Aedes albopictus has invaded. So there are some conditions that do promote coexistence, and we're interested in figuring out what those conditions are, because as I said, when these two species coexist, they are more likely to increase the transmission cycle of West Nile. So we do know, as I said, that mosquitoes, we just have amount on the y-axis, income increasing along the x-axis. We do know that there are more mosquitoes in lower income areas. And because, as we just said, they rely on plant resources, we might expect that we also see more resources supporting this higher population. And yet, actually, most of the time, surveys of vegetation in cities across the US, LA, Denver, Phoenix, Chicago, have all found what they call the luxury effect, that actually higher income neighborhoods host more abundant and more biodiverse plant communities. So it's something like this, which might seem like a bit of a mismatch. Interestingly, Baltimore does not hold with this pattern. A study by Little et al. In 2017 looked at greenery by satellite, and they found equally high levels of greenery in both low and high income neighborhoods, with less in the middle. The thing is, though, that looking at greenery by satellite, you lose out on a lot of that detail. These are some photos that I took in various backyards in West Baltimore, all within a mile of each other, very close together. And yet you can see in a way that a satellite can't see how different these plant communities are. I mean, for example, focusing on the two middle photos, one, you can see that the backyard is entirely paved, and yet by the shade, you can tell that it's got a pretty dense canopy overhead. In comparison, this backyard is fully covered in grass, so you can tell by the sun, this is just shade from a telephone pole, that there's no canopy. So these might appear to be equally green from above, but when we're talking about resources available to a mosquito, here with a dense canopy, we can have a lot of leaves falling into these stagnant pools of water. Whereas in this yard, maybe some grass clippings will fly out of a mower, but we're likely to have a lot less detrital input. So the structure of that community matters, if it's open canopy or closed canopy. And you may also be able to tell just by looking that there are very different species of plants present here. And again, the species of plant present can affect how beneficial that detrital resource base is for larval mosquitoes. So I really wanted to look at vegetation communities on a fine scale across socioeconomic gradients in Baltimore to see if it varies in a way that we're not going to pick up by satellite. These are my study blocks. There are 18 of them, 9 in each of 2 different watersheds. Watershed 263, which is in Baltimore, and the Watts Branch watershed, which straddles Southeast DC and Capitol Heights, Maryland. So each one of these gray polygons is a study block. And despite being clustered pretty close together within each watershed, they display steep differences in socioeconomic status. So for example, Harlem Park, blocks up here, this is the Harlem Park neighborhood of Baltimore. These blocks have median annual household incomes as low as $12,000, and the rate of infrastructural abandonment is 50% or higher. So more than half of these blocks are abandoned. By contrast, some of the blocks that are in the Watts Branch watershed have median annual household incomes as high as $100,000 with little to no abandonment. On each block, I randomly selected 5 occupied properties to conduct surveys. And then on the 6 Baltimore blocks that had substantial levels of abandonment, I additionally selected 3 abandoned properties to also conduct surveys. Depending on the size of the lot, I could do anywhere from 1 to 3 independent vegetation surveys. Baltimore tends to have smaller lots, it's a little more densely populated compared to the Watts Branch watershed. Every time I did a survey, and I did conduct both ground and canopy surveys, but for brevity, we're going to focus on canopy surveys today. I took a photo from 1 meter above the ground of the canopy overhead and used something called Canopy app to determine the percent coverage. So this is an example from one of my Capitol Heights surveys. Took the photo, which is on the left, and then on the right, the app will calculate for me what that percent coverage is, in this case, 53%. And then I identified every individual tree or vine that contributed to the canopy. In this case, we've got 1 silver maple and 1 common catalpa. So in total, I conducted 213 canopy surveys, documenting 74 plant species. Looking first at just the results from occupied properties so that I can consider income as a factor. Of course, there's no income on an abandoned lot, no one lives there, so that was excluded from this analysis. We have income along the x-axis and then percent canopy coverage along the y. And we do see a significant relationship between the two that is in support of that luxury hypothesis. This comes out to about a 2% increase in canopy cover for every $10,000 increase in median annual household income. So this does help explain why we're seeing very high levels of greenery in high-income neighborhoods. I also considered richness as a factor, so that's the number of species that showed up in that canopy photo. It was pretty consistently about 2, regardless of income bracket, no significant relationship for occupied properties. So then why are we seeing such high levels of greenery on low-income blocks? If we compare the percent canopy coverage between abandoned properties and neighboring occupied properties, so looking at ones that are on the exact same block, there is significantly higher canopy coverage on abandoned properties. It's over 40% cover on average compared to just about 25% mean annual coverage or mean canopy coverage on occupied properties. So these abandoned lots have a lot of dense canopy coverage that is still contributing to high levels of greenery on the block as a whole. In this case, we also do see differences in species richness when we compare abandoned properties with their neighboring occupied properties. On average, there are about 1.5 species that showed up in occupied properties on high abandonment blocks, whereas the abandoned properties themselves had an average of 2.5 species in that canopy. Before we get there for a second, priming for that. So we are seeing that there are significant differences in both in structure of that canopy, whether it's more of an open or closed canopy, depending on both income and occupation status. With the abandoned properties having an outsized influence on the total vegetation community for that block. To kind of now get into the community composition, I used an ordination technique called multidimensional scaling that maps the species I documented along the back. You don't need to be able to read this. I know it's very small, but just so you know, all these small codes abbreviated in black in the background, these are each of those 74 different species that showed up in the canopy. The abbreviations that are colorful here, each one of those is one of my 18 study blocks, and the color corresponds to a relative income level. So the blocks that are in red are the lowest income bracket through rainbow order to the blocks in purple representing the highest income bracket. And these blocks are arranged by the model across this background of those 74 plant species according to how similar their canopy community is. So the model will put 2 blocks closer together that have more similar canopy communities, and then the farther apart 2 blocks are, the more different their canopy communities are. I then connected blocks with similar relative income levels so that you get each one of these triangles really representing an income bracket. And the fact that we're seeing some overlap amongst the highest income brackets means that there are some similarities in the species showing up in those canopies. But these lowest 2 income brackets are distinct both from the rest and from each other. Now, these are the 6 Baltimore blocks that have potentially high levels of abandonment. So we're seeing that abandonment not only has an effect in the structure of the canopy, but also is changing the community composition that's present so that it's distinct from higher socioeconomic status blocks. Looking at exactly which species really are dominating in different income brackets, here you're seeing the income bracket in increasing order down this first column. And then across each row, I have listed the top 3 most frequently observed canopy species for that income bracket. I'm going to highlight the non-native species for you in the reddish orange. And pretty quickly, you can see that the lowest income brackets are almost entirely dominated by non-native trees and vines, whereas the highest income brackets are almost entirely native trees, the exception being white mulberry, which was pretty common throughout the entire region. The fact that we're seeing canopy cover on occupied lots increase, but then a greater percentage of canopy cover on abandoned properties is what's helping us see this unique Baltimore pattern that's so different from other cities in which we also have very high levels of vegetation on those lower income blocks. And it's not just structure, but also the composition that's different across these areas. And what we learned from that is that there are very high levels of non-native vegetation in lower income neighborhoods. Past studies have found that non-native vegetation confers a greater benefit to larval mosquitoes than native vegetation does. So the fact that we're seeing differences, especially regarding native status across these neighborhoods, does help support this idea that differences in vegetation are helping to lead to differences and inequitable patterns of mosquito infestation. And this forms the basis for follow-up lab trials. So I then took the results from those field surveys and used them in the lab using different detrital resource bases with the goal of determining if those detrital resource bases influence mosquito population growth rate and the outcome of competition. So as not to bury the lead, I'll say that I did find that there was lower mosquito survival on native plant detritus that's characteristic of high-income neighborhoods. So I identified 6 of the most common trees that I found across these income brackets, and then screened them individually just to check that my mosquitoes wouldn't all die and I would have some data to collect. But I like showing them individually here too as well, so that you can see even visually that there is something different going on in these environments. Look, for example, how dark the red maple is compared to, say, the princess tree. There's something going on here, differences in tannins released, differences in nitrogen and phosphorus, differences in microbial communities that are changing the quality and potentially the quantity of the microbial community that the mosquitoes are feeding on. So tree of heaven and princess tree are the 2 native trees that dominated on low-income blocks. American elm and red maple are the 2 native trees that dominated on high-income blocks. And the non-native white mulberry and native black walnut were pretty consistently found across income brackets. Now, because the average number of species found in a canopy was 2, I then combined these to create detrital treatments that are characteristic of different socioeconomic status. So the low was a combination of tree of heaven and princess tree, regional was a combination, high was a combination of those 2 native species. So these leaves were put into cups and allowed to steep for a little bit, almost like it, before I added the mosquitoes. And the mosquitoes were added in different density ratios. So here we've got the number of Aedes albopictus that were put in the cup compared to the number of Culex pipiens put in. So some treatments had only Aedes albopictus present and no interspecific competition from Culex pipiens. I also had the reverse, where Culex were alone, facing no competition from Aedes albopictus. There were some treatments in which they were present in equal quantities, and some in which they were present in unequal quantities. And playing around with density like this allows us to parse out differences between pressure from intra and interspecific competition. Again, for brevity, I'm not going to be getting into all of the competition results today. I'm really going to focus here on individual life history traits, the main effects from the detritus resource base present. So once I had, once I had these leaves steeping, this little speck that you see moving around in that glass pipette, that is a newly born mosquito. So they get added when they are just hatched to this tea, which I then check every day to see what has emerged into, or what has come into the pupal phase. Pupae were put into individual vials so that when the adult emerged, I already had it trapped. And then we can track how many mosquitoes from a cup survive, how long it took them to go from baby to adult. And then thousands of mosquitoes are currently being kept toasty warm in a warming oven, where they are waiting an undergraduate to measure the wing lengths, which is a really great proxy for overall body size. And using these 3 metrics, the survival, the development time, and the body size, we can calculate lambda, which is the overall rate of population growth. If it's above 1, the population is increasing. If it's below 1, the population is decreasing. Now, I don't have the body length, the wing lengths for body size yet, so I can't present lambda. But if we focus on survival by itself, thinking about the main effects from that detrital resource base, here on the left, we have Aedes albopictus, the percent that survive along the y-axis, and each of our 3 detritus types along the x-axis. Detritus characteristic of high income, low income, and regional. And what you can see is that there was significantly higher percent survival when at least 1 non-native plant was present in the detrital resource base. They were actually about 3 times as likely to survive in the low and the regional compared to the high. For Culex pipiens, Similar setup here on the right for set survival across these three detritus types. Again, we saw that Pipian survival was lowest when the detrital resource base was entirely native. They were about 1.5 times more likely to survive in an entirely non-native resource base, and then like 7 times as likely to survive in the regional treatment, which was unexpected and also unfortunate. We do hope that these results are going to be helpful for mosquito control agencies, and it's always nice to be able to help them target their limited resources to a smaller area. So the fact that the region-wide species seem to be especially beneficial, I think those recommendations harder. But overall, it points to the need to target non-native vegetation wherever it is, as another avenue for trying to control mosquito populations. Looking now at development time, the faster a mosquito develops, the more generations we can have as the mosquito population proliferates over the course of the summer. So faster development is not a good thing on the whole. We've got, again, Aedes albopictus on the left with the number of days it took to emerge as an adult on the y-axis across our same 3 detritus types. Culex pipiens is the same on the right. And here we found a very similar pattern actually between these 2 species, where they took the longest to develop when the detrital resource base was entirely native. In each case, they were 3 or 4 days faster on the low-income detritus, and they were about a week faster on this regional detritus base. So the presence of non-native plant detritus, kind of like we thought, does indeed promote higher mosquito survival and faster development that, once combined with body size, I am expecting will show us higher rates of population growth on characteristically low income and regional detritus. And the implications of this are that we can now start to understand the mechanisms behind these patterns that we previously observed, and this can help us better predict and manage mosquito populations. Now, I'm also in the process of doing a similar type of competition trial, where instead of varying the detrital resource base, I'm varying the temperature. Ultimately, I'm hoping I'm going after the same goal of trying to figure out how conditions in socioeconomically diverse blocks contribute to different mosquito population growth rates. Most of us are aware of the urban heat island effect, this idea that cities tend to be hotter than the surrounding countryside. But additionally, there are inequities in heat and pockets of heat within different blocks in a city. And usually the blocks that are the hottest are the ones that are the lowest income. So we set out, or there were temperature sensors set out on my study blocks in Baltimore over the course of the summer. And I used that data to try to determine a field realistic temperature to raise these mosquitoes. So I had a constant low temperature. I found that higher income blocks, which were a little bit cooler, had a mean temperature of 24 degrees Celsius. And higher income blocks, which tended to be a little hotter, had a mean temperature of 28 degrees Celsius during the month of August, when these 2 mosquito species are at their peak activity. So I'll be raising mosquitoes under those 2 different conditions, a constant low temperature and a constant high temperature. This is typically what studies looking at temperature and mosquito ecology will do. They'll pick a single temperature and maintain it in an incubator throughout the duration of an experiment. But of course, that's not what really happens on actual blocks. Temperatures vary throughout the day, usually hitting a peak high temperature around 2 p.m. in the afternoon, hitting a peak low before sunrise at about 6 a.m. So how realistic is it to hold just a constant temperature, and do these extremes matter more than what that constant is? So I've also got fluctuating treatments. One that goes 19 to 29 degrees Celsius around that same low mean of 24, and a high fluctuating treatment going from 23 to 33 degrees Celsius around that same high mean of 28 degrees Celsius. I'm also using the same density treatments that we had in the detritus competition trials to again look at how these different temperature regimes are affecting intra and interspecific competition between these 2 mosquito species. So this is ongoing, and I'm looking forward to having these results for you if you come to my events, hopefully in the winter. The other things that I have geared up this summer are water chemistry analyses, which I alluded to earlier. So now that I am indeed seeing that there is a connection between the detrital resource base and mosquito life history traits, I want to dig deeper into what it is exactly about those leaves that's creating these differences. So I'll be looking at factors like decay rate, so how quickly those leaves break down, the tannins and lignins they release, levels of nitrogen, phosphorus, and overall levels of microbial activity to see if there is something distinct about the more beneficial species. What's really exciting is that we also got a grant to do some exploratory DNA metabarcoding. This is often an untouched black box in mosquito ecology, that people look at the connection between plants and mosquitoes without that middle step of plants to microbes, microbes to mosquitoes. So we'll be collecting samples of water and mosquitoes on these different detrital resource bases, and then doing DNA metabarcoding to figure out what microbes are there in what quantities, and is that different amongst different resource bases. So that's more to come, but for now, this is what I have for you. I want to thank my advisor first and foremost. I really like this picture of him collecting larval mosquitoes from a toilet in the Baltimore alleyway. I think it really shows his dedication to his craft as well as to his students, so I appreciate that. Along with my committee members, the other PIs on the NSF grant that's been supporting me, and of course my lab members without whom I could not have done all of this field work, could not have maintained live mosquito colonies in the lab. They've been a huge help. And other funding sources, a grant from the Washington Biology Field Club, from the Carey Institute, and of course support from the department. So thank you all so much. I think we have a good amount of time for questions. I'm really happy to take those.
If there's some grads and questions that you can this is probably just going to add another complicating factor that you're already starting thinking about with like water quality analyses. Have you thought about the potential differences in, for instance, insecticide application across the blocks, but also from, for instance, different types of trees and leaves and sort of that factor?
No, because the work that I'm doing is on residential properties, which aren't typically sprayed.
Okay.
So mosquito control agencies, when they go out and they spray their adulticides, it's usually in public lands, wetlands. It's very hard to control mosquitoes that way on private property, first because you need permission, and also because rather than a wetland or a pond, these mosquitoes breed in really cryptic habitat. So I'm sometimes like a bottle cap with a teaspoon of water can hold a mosquito, and you can't go around it. Yeah, so it's not that there would never be an influence from insecticide, but it's really not that common on residential properties because that is a very difficult and also controversial way. People don't love spraying on their property where kids and dogs and whatever are playing. So no, that's not something that I'm incorporating.
Okay, now I'm going to have a couple of questions. First on all those box plots, is the horizontal line mean or the median?
The median.
The median.
The median.
Okay,
Yes.
that explains why it didn't line up with you mentioned the means, but they didn't line up.
Yes, apologies. So I
No,
gave you the mean and the lines in the box plots were the mean.
So we use this term non-native to describe these trees. But I wonder whether it's just a specific species. So if you did this study in urban cities in Asia, where these trees, same trees, were native, do you think you would see a different result? In other words, the mulberry in particular strikes me as being interesting because it has a long history with insects. I'm thinking silkworms. That's right. So maybe there's something about mulberry that's really good for feeding insects, and whether it was native or not, wouldn't have, and that may be the dominating factor in that regional. Because the mulberry was the one tree that was everywhere, so it really may be the mulberry chemistry that's important.
So the trees were in combination, so the white mulberry was in the same detrital resource phase as the black walnut. I do know from when I ran the individual screenings that I do think it's more the white mulberry that is contributing. I didn't include the results of the screening here, but 80 albopictus did best on the mulberry alone. So I do think that is contributing more than the black walnut is, although yes, they are together for all of these results. Yeah, so part of it is, and I think you see this relationship come up a lot between non-native species and not just mosquitoes and plants, where non-natives can often help non-natives. So again, both of these mosquito species are not native to the area, and they seem to be doing really well on species that are also not native to the area. So they may have prior relationships with them. Part of it is also how frequently you see these non-native trees come up in areas where there's little to no management, which is certainly a factor in increasing mosquito infestations as well.
So I guess I'm cautioning you on the language of dividing this into natives and non-natives. I'm not sure that's going to be useful for your study. I suspect it's really the nature of those species, particularly the mulberry, whether it was native or not, or maybe some other native species with similar, leaf chemistries that are not here. You might want to look at the agroforestry. I know this is a little off base, but you might want to look at agroforestry research literature, where people are have studied the decomposition of leaves, the release of nutrients and that kind of thing, phenols and things that interfere with decomposition. I think you might find some relationships with what's also good for the microbes or the mosquitoes.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm looking forward to having those chemistry analyses, the water chemistry analyses to show you, because we will be looking into toxic secondary metabolites, the decay rate, all these things that could be determining which leaves are affecting mosquitoes. Other lab studies, so mine is unique in connecting the leaves directly to socioeconomic factors, but there certainly have been other lab studies that have checked non-native and native growth, not my exact same species. And there is a trend that's emerging, both down in Florida as well as up here. So it's not unique to this area that often the non-native plant, whatever it is, invasive pepper tree compared to native live oak down in Florida, for example, there was a similar competition trial done, and they also found that the non-native species came out on top. So yeah, I hear what you're saying. It definitely might be that there's something about the species, and it's not because it's non-native. I'm interested in looking at exactly what that is, because it does seem like in studies across the country, the non-native vegetation, whatever it is, time and time again, beats out the native vegetation, whatever it is.
So those non-natives that are taking over and are invasive.
So it's mixed. You can have non-natives that are non-invasive. Depends on the study.
But then you don't have very many of those.
And yeah, I don't know what we're talking about the area.
The ecology of this, whether it's really functional of this.
I have a question, I guess, and this might be like even further off. So the pepper tree that you mentioned in Florida, does it have a fruit on it, like on the berry or something like a mulberry or something soft that birds would like to eat?
I think it has some kind of pod. I'm not as familiar with the pepper tree. It's not in this area.
Okay.
It has a little berry, like a holly tree.
Yeah, okay, so I guess so the detritus that you used, I think I missed this. Did you collect that from the site, like under the different trees? Is that how it worked?
So this study that I'm referencing with the pepper tree, it did focus on the leaves specifically. They didn't have the seeds in it. I will double check that, but that's my recollection that they focused on the leaves. I am also focusing on leaves as opposed to other plant parts.
Okay.
Another thing that I left out for the sake of brevity is that I set out passive collection baskets across my residential properties. Left it out for different periods of the summer. I had an early summer, midsummer, and late summer collection, and then sorted through all of that to see how many fruits, seeds, flower petals, twigs, bark, moss, all sorts of plant matter. And it was so overwhelmingly outnumbered in mass by the leaves,
Yeah.
specifically in late summer, when you expect to see a lot of those leaves drop. That the contribution of plant matter to the trail communities, it's really overwhelmingly weak.
Yeah, and the connection I was trying to make though was actually might be the birds. So the mosquitoes like birds, right? That was one of the things you mentioned in the beginning. And I'm just wondering how much of I'm thinking about my backyard now, the mulberry tree. And I hate it when the mulberries come on. I love mulberries, but my car is not too far away from that. And the birds start eating the mulberries, they leave a lot of colorful droppings everywhere.
Yeah.
And so I'm just wondering if the birds microbiome might be getting transferred to the leaves through its droppings, things like that. That like part of your microbiome story or microbe story might be from the birds. Like, and maybe that's helping to shape the microbial communities, whether it's on the leaves, the detritus, or just.
Yeah, that's interesting. We do see, and again, I'm focusing on the larval stage, but these relationships between where the hosts hang out, and the adults can also be a factor in what draws them to an area. Provides resting site, it provides habitat for their blood meals. So there certainly are, a lot of really interesting and complex factors beyond that contained larval habitat and what can get in there. Yeah, that's an interesting thought.
I have a two-part question. First, do you know what the territory range of the mosquitoes you're studying are? And second, you studied several plots within two different watersheds. Do you think that your plots represent the territory that these mosquitoes are inhabiting to properly reflect some of these different variables you're looking at?
So they're pretty widespread. The northern house mosquito tends to be like the northeast part of the country, and then farther up, Aedes albopictus, that it came in through Texas, spread across the southeast, and now it's up into most of the northeast. Just talking about our region and not globally.
Well, kind of like, like they say, like a deer has like a 1 mile square radius. Or like how far do you
Got it. Sorry, I misunderstood your question. Okay, yes. So mosquitoes, there have been studies like mark recapture with mosquitoes, and they can go fairly far distances, but they don't normally, especially in areas where they have a lot of resources available to them and they don't need to travel far. In Baltimore, especially lower income blocks where Aedes albopictus feeds on a lot of rats, they don't need to go very far to get the resources that they need, and they do often live out their entire life cycle on one block. So yes, the unit of inference of one block does capture, where they are going to spend their life cycle, and what's happening on this one block may be entirely different from what's happening 2 blocks over, because the mosquitoes are not likely to go back and forth between those blocks.
So Dr. Beard had a couple questions. They might be related, but she says, thanks for the great talk. She learned a lot. She was wondering, do the mosquitoes feed on the trees or on the herbaceous species? ? Is there a correlation of the understory herbaceous species in the socioeconomic area of mosquitoes?
Okay. So yes, adult mosquitoes will feed on sugars, sometimes directly through the leaves and sometimes the nectar. So actually, in some cases, mosquitoes can act as pollinators. I actually spoke with a gardener who kept a commercial greenhouse of tomatoes, and he thought in the winters that his tomatoes were primarily pollinated by the mosquitoes that lived inside the greenhouse. So yeah, they can get it directly through the leaves or from the nectars and flowers. The next question was about the understory. So the ground surveys that I conducted did also have a relationship with socioeconomic status, both in percent coverage. I apologize, I don't have those graphs here because I was just focusing on the canopy. But they also showed an increase in coverage along increasing income. And I believe there was also a difference in abandoned and occupied properties.
You said you placed collection baskets out. Did you notice any differences in the mass of the leaves between different species? Like Have there been differences in the rate at which they're dropping their leaves throughout the year?
Yes, in terms of, well, in terms of number and mass, I ultimately chose to measure contribution by mass. Since that's what's going to translate into the quantity available to fuel microbial communities. So it also depends on the tree. Common catalpa or princess tree, as I mentioned, for example, princess tree is very large leaves. So even one single princess tree leaf that falls, that's a lot of biomass contributed versus I did see quite a lot of willow oak leaves. Those are pretty small. It doesn't look like your typical oak for the non-plant people. They're kind of elongated and thinner. They don't have your typical oak shape. So I found a lot of those, but each one is very small. So it doesn't, each individual leaf doesn't contribute as much biomass. But yes, I did see differences amongst species in different neighborhoods, both in terms of the number of leaves that fell, and then more importantly, in terms of the biomass contributed by that tree.
Yeah, pardon me if I missed, like, I'm not sure how much interaction you had with the residents.
I had a lot.
Yeah, okay.
Every property, you know, I had to get permission
Yeah, right.
to enter. So yeah, I had knocked on a lot of doors to engage people, let them know what it is that I'm doing, what I'm looking for, and ask permission if they'd be willing to participate. In a lot of cases, that was just a one-time, yeah, sure, go to the backyard and check it out. And then I had a smaller subset of residents who agreed to allow me to return time and time again to set out those early, mid, and late summer baskets. And with those residents in particular, I was really honored to develop a good relationship with. Some of them are, you know, some of them were a little more apathetic, do what you want. But a lot of them were really involved in environmental groups in their community, or were especially interested in the work that I was doing. There were a couple residents in particular that every time I got there, we would chat for like an hour and then I'd be like, I have to go. So, you know, the people who are more interested in were of course more likely to grant me, you know, rights to continue to come back, and I was able to develop a really good relationship with them, which I enjoyed.
Did they have any local knowledge that was helpful for you in doing the research? And also, do they have sort of any expectations for what you're going to be able to sort of produce to help them?
Great questions. They did have some local knowledge that I would say is not something I documented and kind of put into the dissertation, but was just interesting to know and helping me kind of flesh out my understanding of the neighborhoods where I was working. Especially a little bit of a gossipy local knowledge. So 2 houses down keeps a kiddie pool on her front lawn, and it is so full of algae. So you kind of know people's habits and what the issues are in different neighborhoods. You know, is the issue there's an abandoned lot next door that's become an illegal dumping ground, and all of this trash gathers water, or is the issue my neighborhood has this kiddie pool that she's not being paid for? So that adds a little bit to my understanding of, you know, what the different concerns are in these different neighborhoods. And as far as expectations for what's going to come out of it, I do have all their contact information. Immediately after I finished all those surveys at the end of that summer 2020, I gave a little research update on our lab website, and they all had that information. I would like, once I sort of have the rest of my results, to get back in touch and make sure they have those final copies and that they know what came out of their participation. I really appreciate it. And this could not have happened if people didn't say, yes, you are welcome to wander into my yard.
Maybe one more question if there's one.
I think it'd be great if you added more pictures of the trees when you send things to residents, because as a plant person, I'm like, oh, that sounds like a nice tree, but I don't know what it looks like.
Okay.
So yeah, that might, because as someone who lives around here, I'm like, I wonder if I have any of those trees here where I live, things like that, just kind of self-interest. So I wonder if your residents that you send the info to would be really going pictures of that. They'd be like, oh yeah, I do have that tree.
That's a great suggestion.
All right, so I think we can thank Sarah for doing that.